November 1944. A dense forest near the Saar River. The air is cold enough to turn breath into mist. Dozens of American soldiers move like ghosts through the pine needles. Every step is measured. Every branch is gently pushed aside. They use only their hands to speak. A palm held up means stop. 2 fingers pointed forward means move. It is the perfect silence of a professional infantry unit closing in for the kill. Then the silence shatters. A human voice, loud and confident, booms through the trees. It is not the enemy. It is an American officer shouting tactical positions into the freezing air. He thinks he is showing leadership. He is actually signing death warrants. Soon, German guns will find their mark. But before the smoke clears, a different authority will arrive to address the man who traded his men's lives for the sound of his own voice. This is the story of what happened when an arrogant commander's booming voice betrayed his own men, and the devastating response General Patton delivered when he learned the truth. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel today. We specialize in telling the powerful World War II stories that show exactly what happened when a man's rank exceeded his judgment. Staff Sergeant Victor Petrov was 29 years old and hailed from the iron-gray streets of Detroit, Michigan. He had spent his youth in the deafening clatter of the automobile assembly lines, a place where you learn to read a man's intentions by the set of his jaw rather than the sound of his voice. When he reached the front lines with his infantry platoon, that upbringing became his greatest tactical asset. He had seen too many boys buried in shallow graves because of a stray sneeze or the metallic click of a loose canteen in the dark. Petrov lived by a simple, brutal code. If the enemy can hear you, the enemy can kill you. His men moved through the Saar forest like smoke, their eyes constantly searching for the subtle hand signals that dictated their every move. To Petrov, the quiet of the woods was not a void to be filled, but a shield to be maintained at all costs. Directly above him in the chain of command stood Captain Robert Langley, a 33-year-old from Montgomery, Alabama. Langley was a man who carried himself with the stiff, unyielding posture of a courthouse statue, a product of a family that equated volume with authority. His uniform was perpetually pressed, and his boots shone with a mirror-like luster that felt like an insult to the muddy infantrymen who served under him. He firmly believed that a leader's primary duty was to project an aura of absolute dominance through what he called command presence. He frequently told his non-commissioned officers that the American soldier needed to hear the thunder of his commander's voice to find his own courage. To Langley, the battlefield was a stage, and he was the lead actor who refused to speak in whispers. He dismissed the warnings about noise discipline as the anxieties of lesser men, convinced that his booming orders were the only thing keeping the company from crumbling under the weight of the German winter. By November 1944, the Allied advance across Europe had transformed into a grueling war of attrition. The rapid sprints across France were a distant memory, replaced by the freezing mud and dense forests of the German borderlands. Along the Saar River, the terrain was a natural fortress. The woods were thick with pine and fog, hiding the concrete teeth of the Siegfried Line. For the American infantrymen, every step forward was a gamble against a hidden enemy. The Germans had transitioned from a mobile force to a stationary one, burrowing into the earth and waiting. They relied on sound as much as sight. In the stillness of the winter woods, a single metallic rattle or a raised voice could carry for hundreds of yards, providing the precise coordinates for a German mortar team or a machine gun nest. This period of the war saw a strange friction between the men in the foxholes and the officers sent to lead them. Many veteran sergeants had learned that survival required a quiet, predatory stealth. They communicated through a vocabulary of hand signals and whispered warnings. However, some newly arrived officers viewed this silence as a lack of aggression. They had been trained in the traditions of the old army, where leadership was measured by the volume of one's voice and the clarity of one's orders. Many higher-ranking officers let this arrogance slide, viewing it as a healthy display of old-school military spirit. They valued the theater of command more than the grim realities of forest warfare. It was in this atmosphere of misplaced confidence that Captain Langley led his men toward the river, oblivious to the fact that the silence he hated was the only thing keeping his company alive. Petrov caught up to the captain near a cluster of jagged oaks, his boots barely making a sound on the damp floor. He moved with the practiced grace of a man who knew the woods were listening. He reached out and touched Langley's shoulder. A gesture that was technically a breach of protocol, but a necessity in the freezing hush of the Saar. "Captain, you have to stop," Petrov whispered, his voice barely a vibration. "Every word you say is bouncing off these trees and carrying straight to the German line." Langley didn't even look at him. He adjusted the strap of his binoculars and stood tall, his polished helmet catching what little light filtered through the canopy. "I am keeping this column tight, Sergeant. This is a mess of a forest, and I will not have my men wandering off like lost sheep." "It is a quiet forest, sir," Petrov countered. "That makes us loud. The Germans have ears, and they've been sitting in these woods for weeks. They know every echo. Let them have their ears," Langley snapped, his voice rising to a normal speaking volume that felt like a gunshot in the stillness. "They will hear the sound of a commander who isn't afraid to lead. It isn't about fear, sir. It is about tactical noise discipline. We are within the kill zone of their forward observers. I don't lead from the shadows, Petrov. My men need to know I am here. They need the reassurance of a clear order, not a series of frantic handwaves like we're playing a game of charades. They need to stay alive, Captain. Use the arm signals. The NCOs are trained for it. The men know what to do. I have heard enough of this. Arm signals are for scouts and cowards who are too timid to take charge. A real officer uses his lungs. My voice is my primary weapon of command. It is a weapon pointed at our own backs, sir. You just told the whole valley exactly where the 3rd platoon is kneeling. That is enough. I am the commander here. My rank gives me the right to be heard, and my men will hear me. You will return to your squad, and you will move when I tell you to move. Sir, please, think of the approach. That is an order, Sergeant. Silence your tongue and worry about your own feet." The captain turned away and filled his lungs again, his chest heaving with the self-importance of his position. "3rd platoon, move up. 2nd platoon, hold the flank." The response from the woods wasn't a verbal one. It was the rhythmic, tearing sound of a German machine gun opening up from a hidden nest. Then came the high-pitched whistle of mortars. The Germans didn't have to search the brush. They didn't have to guess where the Americans were hiding. They just fired at the coordinates Langley had helpfully provided to the entire forest. Later that afternoon, in the gray light of a makeshift staging area, Major Silas Reed arrived to survey the damage. He saw the rows of stretchers. He saw Petrov, his face smeared with soot and the blood of a corporal he had tried to carry to safety. "Sergeant Petrov, I need a report. How did they catch a veteran unit like yours in the open?" "It wasn't the open, Major. It was the noise." "Explain that." Captain Langley refused to use signals. He shouted every platoon position for the last 300 yards. The Germans just adjusted their sights to match his voice. He was warned about the noise? "Repeatedly, sir." He called it command presence. He said his voice gave the men confidence. The major looked over at Langley, who was standing 20 feet away, dry and clean, looking at a map as if the 14 casualties were just a clerical error. The major's face went hard. He didn't speak a word to the captain. He knew this failure of judgment was written in blood. He walked to his command jeep and picked up the radio handset. The report reached Patton within the hour. The dust of the supply road had not even settled before the familiar hum of a high-performance engine cut through the tension of the command post. A lone jeep skidded to a halt in the center of the muddy camp, its tires throwing up a spray of gray slush. General George S. Patton stepped out, his ivory-handled revolvers glinting against his hip and 4 stars flashing on his polished helmet. He did not say a word to the sentries who snapped to attention. He simply adjusted his belt and walked directly toward the place where Captain Langley stood looking over a set of maps. Patton stopped exactly 3 feet from the captain. His eyes were cold, scanning the pristine, unsoiled state of Langley's uniform before settling on his face with a look of clinical detachment. He spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper, yet it seemed to pin the younger officer to the spot. "Captain Langley, did you lead the company approach on the Saar Woods this morning?" Langley snapped to attention, his heels clicking in the mud. "Yes, General. I led the primary assault from the front, sir." Patton tilted his head slightly. "And did you utilize the standard infantry hand signals during that approach through the dense brush?" "No, General. I found them insufficient for maintaining tactical cohesion in the dark." "So you chose to vocalize your commands instead?" "I did, sir. I believe a commander's voice is his greatest asset for maintaining the morale of his men." Patton looked past Langley toward the rows of stretchers where the 14 casualties lay under blood-stained wool blankets. He began to speak, his voice a low, terrifying rasp that carried much further than Langley's shouting ever could. "You believe your voice is an asset, Captain. You think the sound of your own lungs is a valid substitute for the lives of the men under your command. You stood in a quiet forest and screamed out the literal blueprint of your formation. You did not give your men confidence, you gave the German army a target. German prisoners were brought into this camp less than an hour ago. Do you know what they told our interrogators? They said they did not even have to look through their scopes to find your platoons. They said they just listened to your voice and adjusted their machine guns to hit exactly where you announced your men were standing. You did not lead an attack. You narrated a massacre. Staff Sergeant Petrov and his men were moving in total silence. They were professional soldiers doing the hard, quiet work of staying alive. While they were crawling through the freezing mud to protect this country, you were treating the battlefield like a parade ground in Alabama. You chose your own ego over their physical safety. You chose the theater of command over the grim reality of war. A commander who cannot be quiet is a commander who cannot be trusted. Trust is not built on how loud you can yell. It is built on the confidence that you will do everything in your power to bring your men home alive. You failed that trust. You traded 14 American lives for the privilege of hearing yourself talk in a forest. You have a choice right now. You can admit here and now that your judgment was a criminal failure, or you can face a general court-martial for gross negligence and cowardice. Either way, you are relieved of your command effective immediately. I will not have a man in my army who thinks his voice is more important than the blood of his soldiers. Decide now." Langley looked at the general's unblinking eyes and then at the stretchers nearby. The arrogance finally drained from his face as the weight of the silence hit him. "I understand, sir," he whispered. Patton did not nod. He simply waited for the next step. Patton turned to Major Reed and gestured toward the disgraced officer. "Major, take this man's sidearm and his insignia. He is no longer a commander of American soldiers. He is a ghost in a uniform, under the watchful eyes of the entire company." Reed stepped forward and unbuckled Langley's holster. The leather creaked in the sudden, heavy stillness that had fallen over the camp. Langley stood frozen, the polished shine of his boots now caked in the thick, gray mud of the Saar. He watched as his men, the very soldiers he had betrayed with his booming pride, began to gather their gear. There were no shouted orders now, no thunderous commands. On Patton's direct signal, the company formed up in a line that stretched back into the dark trees. Each man moved with a deliberate, haunting quietness. They checked their packs and adjusted their rifles, using only the softest touches and silent glances. As the column began to march back toward the front, they passed Langley one by one. Not a single soldier looked at him. Not a single voice was raised. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic rustle of wool and the damp thud of boots on the earth. Langley stood in the center of that soundless procession, stripped of his voice and his power, realizing too late that the silence he had once mocked as cowardice was the only thing that could have kept his men alive. Victor Petrov returned to Detroit in 1946. He did not go back to the loud assembly lines of his youth. Instead, he found work as a forest ranger in northern Michigan, seeking the same silence he had once used as a shield in the Saar. He never spoke to his family about the morning the trees betrayed him, but he kept a notched pocket knife that had belonged to a corporal lost in the woods. Petrov lived a long, quiet life, passing away in 1994 at the age of 79. He was buried with honors, though he always felt he was carrying the weight of 14 men who should have come home with him. Robert Langley's career as a combat leader ended in that mud-caked camp. He was reassigned to a stateside training depot where his voice could do no more harm. After the war, he returned to Montgomery and tried to enter local politics, but the booming authority he prized so highly failed to win him a seat. He remained a bitter man, convinced until his death in 1978 that Patton had sacrificed a brilliant career for the sake of tactical technicalities. He died in a house filled with polished metals that could not wash away the memory of his own shouting. Patton rarely spoke of the incident afterward, but he issued a stern training directive that became law in his sector. Hand signals became mandatory within 200 meters of the enemy. He once wrote in a letter that a commander who shouts in a forest is a man who has forgotten his duty to his soldiers. He believed the deadliest approach was always the quietest, and he never again let an officer trade American blood for the sound of his own voice. Some historians have argued that Patton's summary relief of Captain Langley was an act of extreme impatience, suggesting that combat stress can cloud the judgment of any officer. They contend that Langley was simply attempting to maintain order in a chaotic and low-visibility environment. Others have argued the opposite, insisting that the captain's refusal to heed his veteran sergeants constituted a criminal level of negligence. To these observers, Patton's swift intervention was a vital necessity that saved lives by reinforcing the priority of stealth in forest warfare. What is certain is that the training directive issued after this incident fundamentally changed how American infantry operated, making silence a mandatory weapon of war. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have stripped the captain of his rank on the spot? Or would you have given him a second chance to learn the value of tactical silence? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about when a man's rank exceeded his judgment, make sure to subscribe.